Welcome in, friends. My name is Ellesmere, and today I want to talk about the frequently asked questions of Holy Paladin. Now that the War Within Season 1 is launched, I've been getting a lot of the same questions, so I just wanted to make a video to kind of break down each question and each answer to try and provide more context. The first question I get asked about a lot is, do we use Word of Glory or Light of Dawn? The answer is both. In Mythic Plus, you're only going to be using Word of Glory. It's pretty rare that you want to use Light of Dawn. The only time I would say I use it is if you're in a 5-man melee group, or if your group is stacked up and all the damage that's going out is even, meaning there's nobody that's significantly lower than somebody else health-wise. In Raid, however, you want to use both. Not only are we running Empyrean Legacy in most raid builds, which means you're going to be casting Word of Glory every 20 seconds or so, no matter what, but additionally, the total healing that you're going to get out of either Word of Glory or Light of Dawn is now pretty much the same, with the slight advantage going to Light of Dawn. And that means that for any fights where there's significant spot healing required, most of your holy power will be spent on Word of Glory, whereas in fights where you just want generic AoE healing, most of your holy power should be spent on Light of Dawn. Then there's some fights that are more mixed, where you're going to want to use Light of Dawn during the AoE and Word of Glory when you need spot healing. Basically, the idea is neither one is significantly higher HPS, so you just want to use whichever one is best within that moment. The next question I get asked about a lot is Light of the Martyr. So Light of the Martyr was something that was looking really good going into the start of the expansion, but the issue with Light of the Martyr is that it currently functions with overhealing, not effective healing. That means that if you were to Holy Shock someone at 100% health, you would still get the full healing absorb on yourself. Because of that, casting things like Divine Toll become very dangerous with Light of the Martyr, and the healing increase that you get from Light of the Martyr is actually canceled out by the amount of healing that you have to do on yourself to clear the absorb. So because of that, Light of the Martyr is actually an effective healing decrease. Now I say effective healing because Light of the Martyr technically does increase your HPS on logs, but it does not increase your effective HPS, it actually lowers it. That means that the benefit of the HPS that you're giving to the raid does not increase with Light of the Martyr, it actually decreases. However, your total healing gets increased. That might seem a little bit confusing, but the idea is that the healing absorb that you put on yourself should be counted as negative HPS because it's then more healing that has to be done. So you're dealing damage to yourself, essentially. Now, this used to be counted against us in logs when it actually did damage to our health pools, but now that it creates a healing absorb instead, it's not counting against us in logs, and that is artificially inflating our logs to show higher healing with Light of the Martyr talented than it otherwise would. This is causing a bit of controversy because obviously it's making our healing look bigger for the players who are running it in raid, and as such, you know, people are worried about significant nerfs due to how those logs are appearing. I think that this is a little overblown. I do think that to a certain extent, the Light of the Martyr logs are being inflated, and it does have a skewed effect on how our spec is viewed HPS wise, but it's not nearly as significant as some people are making it out to be. Blizzard does not solely look at logs to tune. We aren't going to get nerfed into the ground just because of some extra Light of the Martyr healing. In general, yes, Light of the Martyr will increase your HPS on logs, but it will not increase your effective healing. It's actually 2 wasted talents, all for a decrease in effective healing for your raid. So I would personally not suggest running Light of the Martyr. That being said, you will see it on top logs because of the artificial inflation of this talent, but that does not mean that it's a good talent. The next thing I want to talk about is Beacon of Faith versus Beacon of Virtue. Now, this is something I covered in my last video a little bit. However, I want to go a little bit more in depth regarding raid. What Beacon of Virtue is going to give you is a lot of generic AoE healing, which is good for a lot of fights. However, many players think that Beacon of Virtue is a significant HPS increase compared to Beacon of Faith. That's actually not true. Beacon of Faith and Beacon of Virtue are very similar in terms of total healing output, and in fact, most of the time, Beacon of Faith is going to yield better results for the majority of players, as Beacon of Virtue requires more min-maxing when it comes to exact timings and pooling your resources in between, and there's a lot more intricate play that can be messed up. Even among the top players, though, Beacon of Faith and Beacon of Virtue are very similar HPS throughput wise. While the generic AoE healing of Beacon of Virtue is good, in my opinion, it doesn't outweigh the strength of Beacon of Faith, because Virtue comes with a lot of downsides. First off, you have to spend a global every 15 seconds. Second off, the mana consumption from Virtue is very, very, very large. Third, Beacon of Virtue isn't targeted, it's just generic AoE. So you're not going to be able to funnel your healing into certain targets the way that you could with Beacon of Faith. In my opinion, the much better healing profile is Beacon of Faith, as you can place your beacons on 2 of the most endangered people during a fight and provide an insane amount of safety for those players. Not only that, you're not really losing much HPS, and you are gaining so much mana efficiency that you can actually give your Blessing of Winter to other healers that consume significantly more mana. I played with Beacon of Faith for all of Heroic progression this week, and I never dropped below 80% mana on any fight, while pulling the same numbers that anyone running Virtue was, but with just an insane more amount of mana efficiency. Being able to give your Blessing of Winter to another healer is actually very impactful and provides a lot of mana to them throughout a fight. So I would suggest running Beacon of Faith for a few reasons. That, the better targeted healing, you get to prioritize the right people with Beacon of Faith, and also just the fact that rotationally it's a lot more simplistic. As for Mythic Plus, Beacon of Virtue is definitely what you want to take. It's solo healing content, so you can't rely on other healers to cover the generic AoE healing. You need to have strong AoE burst healing, and the new dungeons have perfect damage patterns for Virtue. So I don't really suggest Faith for any dungeon, except maybe Necrotic Wake. Blessing of Seasons is a very strange talent that people are still getting used to using. I talked about it a little bit in the last video, but I'm just going to cover it again from more of a raid perspective. In raid, you can get a ton of value from the damage of Summer if you time it right with your wings and with damage patterns of the fight. The other 3 seasons are just about getting back to Summer as fast as possible, so you always want to send the other 3 on cooldown. Who you send them on is kind of up to you. Generally speaking, you can send Autumn and Spring on yourself. And then Winter, if you're running Virtue, you want to use on yourself. But if you're running Faith, like I was saying, you want to use your Winter on another healer, as you should already be very, very mana efficient if you're running Faith. For Blessing of Summer, the main thing is to tie it in with your cooldowns. You always want to use it on yourself. It changed significantly from Dragonflight, where we place it on a DPS to proc more damage. Now, it converts healing into damage, so you want to make sure that you line up your Blessing of Summer with your Wings cast in order to get the most value from a damage perspective. Our next topic is going to be Avenging Crusader versus regular Wings. Now, this was a very common discussion during beta, and it's kind of died down a bit as everybody sees the strength of regular Wings and being able to target your healing more. The thing about Avenging Crusader is that in order for it to be viable, it always has to be significantly higher HPS than regular Wings, because you're losing out on a much better healing profile when you go Avenging Crusader. What I mean by healing profile is with regular Wings, you get to target your healing significantly more. Much more of your power goes into Holy Shock and Word of Glory and all of your more targeted spells, versus Avenging Crusader, which is just full generic smart healing that you really have no control over where it goes. Currently, Avenging Crusader is not in a position of being significantly higher HPS than regular Wings. In fact, it's barely even competing HPS-wise as is. That means that if you want to run Avenging Crusader because you have fun with it, go for it. It's not trolling. It is a good talent, and you will see similar HPS values. But if you're looking for more serious progression and you really want to min-max your spec, then you're going to want to stick with regular Wings. In Mythic Plus, you can play either. I have both a regular Wings and an Avenging Crusader build on Wings is Up. However, I do recommend the regular Wings as the default for Mythic Plus, only switching to Avenging Crusader Lightsmith if you're doing one of the older dungeons that doesn't really require much healing, or you're overgearing content and just want to focus on getting the most damage out of your spec as possible. My next topic I'm going to keep relatively brief. This is just a discussion about Herald versus Lightsmith, our new hero talents. I discussed this more in depth in my last video. However, I'm just going to do a quick recap for those who didn't see it. Basically, Herald of the Sun is the healing hero talent, and Lightsmith is the damage utility hero talent. So Herald of the Sun definitely gives you the most amount of healing, so in raid it should always be your go-to. In Mythic Plus, it's generally going to be your go-to as well, except maybe in the older dungeons where there's less healing requirement. Everything about Herald of the Sun feels great. It's a really fun hero talent. We have a lot of unique talents on the tree, all of which increase our healing significantly, both from an AoE perspective with things like Second Sunrise and Sunseer, and Luminosity, but also from a single target perspective where we gain Eternal Flame, which replaces Word of Glory as basically the same thing as Word of Glory, but with an additional hot effect to it. It also increases the healing done to yourself, which makes it extra strong for personal survivability. On the other side of things, Lightsmith definitely does the most damage, and it brings a lot of effective health increases with the shields that it's constantly proccing, but it has a lot of dead talents on its tree, from Rite of Sanctification to Shared Resolve, Hammer and Anvil, Fear No Evil. A lot of these talents are making it so that Lightsmith can't really shine from a healing perspective, and instead is basically just a damage utility hero talent, which is fine for some dungeons and fine for some content, but in general, for most content, you are going to be defaulting to Herald of the Sun unless there are some significant changes to our hero talents. One of the biggest things about min-maxing Herald of the Sun is Holy Prism. So Dawnlight is Herald of the Sun's main talent, and basically every time that you cast Holy Prism, your next 2 holy power spending abilities apply Dawnlight, which is a hot or a dot to an enemy or ally. It's currently bugged. It is supposed to only radiate 8% of its damage and healing to nearby allies or enemies reduced beyond 5 targets, but it is currently not being reduced beyond 5 targets, so you're going to see Dawnlight is a huge source of our healing at the moment. I'm guessing this is going to get fixed at some point, and when it does, our HPS will definitely see a drop, but I'm hoping that that is compensated a little bit with potentially a buff to Dawnlight itself. We're going to have to see what Blizzard does with that, but for now, Holy Prism is a very, very core and important part of this spec, and knowing exactly when to Holy Prism will also be able to min-max you a lot of damage because of Sun's avatar. Sun's avatar creates beams when you have wings and you have Dawnlights out. Now, activating wings itself applies these Dawnlights, so you don't really have to worry about it when you're pressing wings itself, but it's very important to time your Holy Prism with Awakening, because you want to get the most out of your Sun's avatar value as well. Basically, the way it works is you want to be Holy Prisming as much as possible, so ideally on cooldown. However, if your Awakening stacks are getting high and you're getting close to Awakening and Holy Prism comes back up, you should generally hold it for a little bit until your Awakening is available. And vice versa, if your Awakening comes up early, but your Holy Prism is up in 5 seconds or so, then you just want to fill the GCDs with something other than Judgment so you don't proc your Awakening until your Holy Prism is ready. Ideally, you want to Holy Prism the global before you cast your Awakening Judgment to proc it. That way, your first 2 spenders coming straight into Awakening will proc your Dawnlights, and you'll get full value out of your Sun's avatar beams since they last 10 seconds. Another question I get asked a lot is, how do I use Divine Favor? Do we want to prioritize Divine Favor spot healing in Raid? How should I use it in Mythic Plus? Basically, Divine Favor is the only casting talent that we take in this build, and we take it because it's actually a very strong spot heal when combined with Infusion of Light, which we proc plenty of. Ideally, you want to use this anytime that you need a big spot heal and you don't have Holy Power and you have Infusion. I know that's a fair amount of qualifiers, but that actually happens very frequently, and Divine Favor itself lasts forever, so you don't actually have to worry about spending it quickly. Now, sometimes in Raid, you will not need to spend it, and sometimes in M+, you will not need to spend it. There are plenty of times when you just don't need a big spot heal and instead would prefer to just be AoE healing or just dealing damage, and that's fine. It's not something that you necessarily always have to spend. I'd say in general, in Raid and M+, I only use about half the Divine Favors that I proc, which is totally fine. You don't always need spot healing, and that's okay. If you don't need the spot healing, just sit on it and don't worry about using it. Just pretend like you don't even have it. And eventually, once you need the spot heal, you'll still have it ready to go. The next thing I want to talk about is secondary stats. I discussed this a little bit during my last video. However, secondary stat priority has changed a little bit, and I kind of want to discuss the 2 different sets of priorities that we have. We have one set of priorities for Raid. Now, for Raid, Haste is king. Same thing with M+, actually. Haste across all content is king. That's because Holy Power generation is so important to our spec right now. Because our spenders got buffed, they're actually doing healing again, so the more Holy Power we can generate, the happier we're going to be. Basically, you want as much haste as you can get, except I probably wouldn't go past 30%. That would be a crazy amount of haste to get stacked up this early on in the expansion. However, you probably could. I wouldn't recommend going much past it. My ideal haste percentage is probably somewhere around 25%. However, I wouldn't complain about having a little bit more. Mastery is the next best secondary stat for us in Raid. This got a lot of value a few patches ago when they reintroduced this talent, Beacon of the Lightbringer, which makes it so our mastery is now increased based on either you or your Beacon of Light, whichever is closer. So mastery is very, very strong in Raid. It's our highest raw healing talent. That being said, for progression, you may want a little bit more damage in DR, so you could go slightly higher into Verse. Crit and Verse are pretty similar in terms of strength, but Verse gets the slight advantage overall in Raid due to the fact that it provides us with damage reduction. So Raid, your stat priority is looking like Haste, then Mastery, and then Verse/Crit, with the slight edge going to Verse. As for Mythic Plus, same thing as always. You're going to have Haste at the top, but you're going to have Mastery at the bottom now because Mastery provides no damage increase compared to Crit or Verse. And damage from healers is a lot more important in Mythic Plus compared to Raid. Not to say that Raid damage isn't important, but in Raid, you generally want to put most of your focus into your healing power and not worry so much about min-maxing your damage from a secondary stat perspective. But I digress. Basically, Haste, and then Crit/Verse, and then Mastery. The next question I get asked a lot is just what are the best Raid builds? And for this, I'm going to take you to Wings Is Up, where I have posted the Solar Crusade build. In my opinion, this build is the best Mythic Plus and Raid build. It uses two separate versions. You have one for Mythic Plus and one for Raid. You can copy the talent build just by clicking this link right here. And below these pictures of the talent setup, you can see a breakdown of what your general rotational priority will look like for both Mythic Plus and Raid. The last question I get asked a lot about is embellishments and crafting. What should we craft at the start of the expansion? What should we craft when the season starts? What am I doing with all my sparks? So for this, I'm going to take you to the gear section of Wings Is Up, and I'm going to take you down to the embellishment area. Currently, these are the best embellishments for Mythic Plus and Raid. Now, my suggestion is generally that you should craft a weapon the first week of Mythic. A weapon is going to give you the biggest bump in throughput immediately, and our best Raid embellishment is Darkmoon Sigil Ascension, which you can place on your weapon. I think that for me and most players, I would recommend doing this first, and then your second embellishment being the Writhing Armor Band, which is just going to double the effect of your weapon. But that being said, if you are solely interested in Mythic Plus, you can just jump straight into the Mythic Plus ones. These are unfortunately not amazing embellishments. That being said, no embellishments really are. People like to exaggerate the value of embellishments greatly. We're talking about 1% throughput gain. These are very, very minor effects and really don't impact your throughput overall. Your best ones in Mythic Plus are going to be Binding of Binding and Fractured Gemstone Locket. This has the added benefit of going on jewelry, which means that you can choose your secondary stats on the most valuable secondary stat pieces, which is nice. They are going to provide the most damage. They aren't going to provide you with much healing. However, none of the embellishments will in Mythic Plus. Unfortunately, our best embellishment for healing is Darkmoon Sigil Ascension, the Raid one, but that one drops when you exit combat, which makes it very, very, very bad for Mythic Plus because you're just going to constantly be dropping your stacks in between packs. In general, if you're interested in embellishments and figuring out what to craft first, I highly suggest coming here. This will give you the most up-to-date information. Embellishments are still being tuned, trinkets are still being tuned, but this is where you're going to find, you know, the best embellishments, the best trinkets, and what I generally think that you should be crafting at that time for whatever content type you're doing. Obviously, except PvP, I got no idea what I'm doing with that. Finally, the last thing I'm going to cover on this topic is, are the September 13th announced nerfs a big deal? So for those of you who don't know, on September 13th, they announced some nerfs to Holy Paladin. It's coming soon on Tuesday. Basically, we're getting our healing reduced by 6%, but we're getting a ton of single target damage buffs, and Avenging Crusader is getting nerfed to offset those damage buffs. Overall, this results in a very, very, very slight, like 1% healing boost for Avenging Crusader. Really not relevant. Avenging Crusader will still not be the go-to talent. These healing changes really don't impact the meta very much. I think that HPAL is still going to be top tier for Raid and M+. It's a very, very strong healer right now, both from a throughput perspective and a survivability perspective for yourself and your group. I do think that its AoE damage is very low relative to other healers, so in Mythic Plus, that might need some tuning later on in the season. But right now, when most people are focused on Raid, I'm happy to see that the healing reduction was only 6% and really didn't impact our playstyle at all. And we're getting some really nice single target buffs, which we desperately needed. Overall, I'm really happy with these changes. I think that people are super overblowing the 6% healing reduction. It's really not going to be that impactful. Our healing is still going to be great, and I just think don't worry about it at all. We're still in a very, very good position. We're still very, very strong, and there's no need to doom. I know that people want me to discuss 11.0.5 and the changes that were made to the class tree. I will do that in another video, but I want to give Blizzard one more week of PTR updates to really get some of those talents ironed out, because I know for a fact that there's no way that those talents are anything other than just an initial iteration done by one of the teams. I'm guessing the PvP teams based on the amount of PvP talents involved. Patience is important when it comes to PTR. It's really important not to overreact immediately and understand that the very first things that are pushed to PTR are often heavily changed. So don't stress. I promise that if no changes are made next week, we will take to the forums. I will make a video. We will discuss the new class talents at length and try to get a lot of really good feedback for the devs. That's all for now, guys. I hope I answered most of your questions. If you have any other questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I will try to answer them as soon as I can. Thanks, guys, and have a nice day.